Well, the federal government is opening the door to a major shakeup in how Canada's airports are run. Transport Minister Stephen McKinnon says Ottawa is in the early stages of talks with airport authorities about possible privatization, or at least new ownership models framed around improving efficiency and passenger experience. McKinnon insists airports will remain a public good, but the government is also talking about unlocking value, language that raises questions about whether private investment or even proceeds flowing into a sovereign wealth fund could be on the table. Let's talk more with our next two guests. We're joined now by Jake Fuss, Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute. Jake, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me on.
And I know you have made the case for privatizing airports in the past, so we're happy to have your voice here. And also joining us this morning is Jacques Roy. He's a professor at HEC, and he literally wrote a book about the saga of Mirabel and Dorval airports. Jacques, welcome to the program.
Oh, good morning.
Okay, guys, let's start this off. And Jake, I'll start off with you. Why don't you give me your take here? When you hear the federal government talk like this, they've done it in the past, by the way. We've seen the door open previous times and nothing ever happened. What do you think about what you heard from the transport minister and any notion of doing things differently with Canadian airports?
Well, I think it's a change that's long overdue. This is something that's been studied time and time again by the government itself. There was a report 10 years ago that basically called for these changes in addition to a broader package of reforms that should be made to the airport and airline industry as a whole. And right now we have a very expensive airline and airport system in Canada that largely is outdated and out of step with a lot of our peer countries around the world. Moving to a privatized model is actually going to be a way that we can lower costs, operate more efficiently and effectively over time, while at the same time improving service quality for consumers. This is something that's been done in the European Union, in Australia, in New Zealand, with great success. And I think this is something that we should be trying to emulate here in Canada as well.
Jacques, how do you view it?
Well, I also did study the different types of governance organization around the world, and it varies a lot. There's full privatization, like Heathrow Airport in London, but there's also a crown corporation like Singapore Airport, which is considered one of the best. So there's no evidence that one typical model, is winning over the others. The Canadian system may not be perfect, but it was established to increase the commercial activities at our airports. And also, let's be frank, to let the airports finance those major investments that are required. And they do it by charging us passengers airport improvement fees, and airlines also fees. And I agree with Jake, the system in Canada is expensive, but it's based on a user pay system. So in a way, it's normal that if you want to travel to Hawaii or Mexico, that you should pay your share.
You know what? I actually want to spend some time here. And Jake, I'll ask you about this. Like, why do you think the current system is failing? I think before we go down a path of changing the system and maybe go in privatization or another route, why don't we make the case here that the current system doesn't work? What would you say to that?
I think there's really three contributing factors. So the first part is what we're talking about today, which is the airport ownership model. So basically how it operates right now is the federal government owns the land that the airports operate on, and then we have not-for-profit airport authorities that have to pay rent back to the federal government to the tune of about $500 million a year. Those costs are passed on to consumers in the form largely of airport improvement fees to recoup a lot of that lost revenue. We generally have higher fees and taxes as well compared to other peer countries on our airplane tickets. So anywhere from about 25 to 35% of the airfare that you're paying is going straight towards taxes and fees, which is ultimately raising the cost. At the same time, too, we also restrict foreign competition in the Canadian airline space as well. So American airlines, European airlines, Asian airlines, for instance, are largely not able to operate in Canada, flying a passenger from, say, Montreal to Vancouver, for instance. So then you have very limited competition between, only a couple of players or, two or three players in Canada. And that's ultimately pushing costs up higher. So it's not just the airport ownership model in Canada that needs to change. It's also a lot of the restrictions, taxes, and fees that we're placing on the industry as well.
And Jacques, why don't we talk a bit about the current system and as you see it, maybe what you think works well about our current system. Maybe you want to extol the virtues of what we're doing right now and maybe piggyback on some of what you heard Jake say.
The current system was established 30 years ago. It seemed like a good idea at the time. My concern is that the federal government has let go of control over the major decisions that airports are making. For example, right now in Montreal, there's a $10 billion project to improve capacity. In Toronto, I don't have the number, but it's even bigger. So are all these investments required? Are they done properly? And as a result, will we have to increase airport improvement fees again? And, the public doesn't really have a say. And if you go to general assemblies, they usually complain about the noise, but no one is really caring about the financial situation. So the current system is not perfect. And I suggest that we should reopen the leases with airports, that the federal government should step in and have control mechanisms over major investments and fee increases. And I fail to see how a private organization would do better because they would, now let's say it's a pension fund, they will ask for 8% return on their investment. So you will simply replace the rent airports pay with a dividend that you would have to pay to the private organization. But I also agree with Jake that if you look overall with the airline competitiveness, it has been looked at last year, and it's a difficult problem because Canada is a large country, the density of population is small, so it's very difficult to have low-cost airlines in Canada. And we've heard the news this weekend that Spirit Airlines has gone bankrupt. So it's tough to operate airlines in Canada, and as a result, there's less competition. And I agree with Jake that the airline fares are not just too high.
Jacques, as you said, the current system is not perfect. I'm sure Jake would agree with you on that front, that it's not perfect. All right, we're continuing our discussion on the privatization of Canadian airports and maybe a different model for how we run our airports. Joined this morning by Jake Fuss. He's Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute. And Jacques Roy is a professor at HEC, and he literally wrote a book about the saga of Mirabel and Dorval airports. Okay, so gentlemen, I want to talk about the path forward here. And first things first, I want to talk a bit about, a little bit more about the current way the airports are run. Because I have a question from a listener who sends me this note. Wait, hold on a second. Aren't the major airports like Trudeau, Pearson, and the Vancouver airport, aren't they already privatized, at least the terminals? And of course, we have these bodies like Aéroport de Montréal here in the city. So Jake, how would you answer that listener here? Because I think there is some confusion about just what system we have right now.
Yes, it's a good question. So kind of the short answer is that it's sort of partially privatized is how I would phrase it. So up until the 1990s, the federal government served as both the owner and operator of Canada's major airports. The Chrétien government then partially privatized and transferred the operation of major airports to not-for-profit airport authorities, while the federal government has remained the owner of the land that they operate on. And since then, the federal government has effectively been the landlord for Canada's airports, collecting rent each year from the not-for-profit operating airport authorities. And those costs are ultimately passed on to consumers. So that's kind of the compromise that the government came up with in the 90s. But that's now a very unique model in the world, which is quite different than how a lot of other countries operate their airports.
Do you think that one of the reasons why this is such a tricky thing to discuss, or a tricky thing to find a solution for, is that we have examples of private models and public models that work incredibly well. Like, it seems like any path we go, we could find success. And I'm just thinking about, like, I was at the New Orleans airport and it was amazing. I was like, wow. And my default setting was, oh, this is America. It's a private airport. That's why it's amazing, right? Lo and behold, it's a public airport. It's owned by the city of New Orleans, and it's awesome. So I wonder, Jacques, let me get your take on this one. And you mentioned some other airports before. Couldn't we actually find success regardless of model?
Yes, we can. Actually, when you look at the successful airports, it's not necessarily the governance model. It's basically the management team. And even in Canada, there are different success stories with our own airports. Some have taken the opportunity to invest in projects that were not really required, and as a result, users pay for useless investments. Other airports have been managing very carefully, and as a result, their airport improvement fees have not increased that much. So it's not only the model; it's the way you manage, and it's sad in a way, but that's the way it is.
Jacques, finish your thought. Go ahead, Jacques. Finish your thought. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's why I think that the most important thing is for the government to step in, because they will have to anyway. Airports are running out of capability to finance those major projects. And if the government is going to have to intervene, they may as well step in and reopen the leases that are very restrictive right now, and for government, and make sure that the next investments and fee increases are based on solid decision making.
Jake, I wonder if you find the same thing, that you can find successes around the world with different models, and why don't you make the case that the privatization model is the right one?
Yeah, I think, when we look at the privatized airports around the world, whether that's in the European Union, in Australia or New Zealand, I highlight those countries in particular because they have similar population densities to Canada, and used to operate similarly to Canada in the 1990s, but then ultimately went a different direction. If you look at the results of post-privatization in those countries, they were able to lower costs, lower ticket prices for consumers, increase their service quality, generate more employment in the industry, have more routes and greater frequency served. In the case of the European Union, they were also able to introduce low-cost carriers to the system following those changes, in conjunction with changes that they also made in terms of allowing for more competition in the airline space. So I think, if we're just looking at something in a vacuum and saying, only changing the ownership model one way or another is going to change the entire system, I think we're going to be disappointed. I think we need to have a broad package of reforms that are made in the system, not just with airports, but going much, much further.
I think Jacques was making a point about whatever the model is, when you have really good leadership, right? When the people that are running the airports are competent, you get great results. Would you contend that in the private system, you have a greater likelihood of having competent leadership, Jake?
I think the leadership aspect gets overstated a little bit. I think it has more to do with the incentive structure. So right now in the not-for-profit system, you really don't have an incentive to keep costs down. Airport fees continue to go up as they have to generate more revenue to pay for infrastructure improvements over time. But there really isn't that same incentive to keep costs low. Whereas if you have a privatized airport, yes, they do have an incentive to increase revenue, just like a not-for-profit airport authority would. But they have a much greater incentive to actually lower costs and lower fees over time, because they ultimately want to attract people to that airport, and they ultimately want to generate their profits at the end of the day. And lowering costs is one of the ways that they can do that. So I think it has a lot more to do with the incentive structure rather than the leadership structure at a lot of these organizations.
Jacques, give us the other perspective here on not going the privatization route, and how other pathways could be better here.
Going back to Australia, yes, they were privatized, but at the same time, the government kept a kind of a control mechanism. There is a kind of committee, if you want, or a scrutiny process whereby fee increases and major investments are looked at. So even though it's privatized, they still are monitored by the government, which can explain why the fees have not increased that much and that they are more competitive. And that's what I suggest that we should be inspired with, whether in the current system or any system, you need to keep some kind of a balance and check and balance on those major investments. There was too much freedom given to our airports, and once again, some have done well, some have done not so well. So I suggest we go back to more control, and as a result, we may have more efficient airports.
Jake, last word will go to you on checks and balances here, and the importance of that, even in a private system.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, like, I'm glad Jacques mentioned Australia. They still have, regulations in the system from the government. And in Australia and New Zealand, the government can still buy a stake in those airports themselves, too. So even if they're publicly traded, like in the case of the Auckland airport in New Zealand, so the government can still have a role to play in a private market through regulation or buying stakes in the airports themselves. But I don't think that precludes, privatization from being the best way forward. I still think it's the way that ultimately Canada needs to be moving, and then we can have a discussion about what that model exactly looks like in the Canadian context.
Gentlemen, I have to leave it there. Thanks to the both of you for coming on this morning. Appreciate the discussion.
Thanks for having us on.
Jake,
have a good day.
You too. Jake Fuss there, Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute, and Jacques Roy is a professor at HEC.
The newest tracks. Let's go. New music. And the next big thing.
Always on the new music first.
Your first place to hear it all.
'Cause you gon' like it, love it, wanna play it twice. Playing now.
iHeart New Music. Your digital station for brand new drops, fresh finds, and tomorrow's bangers.
I think we need something new.
Discover iHeart New Music. Always fresh, always first. Stream now on the free iHeartRadio app.